go ahead and start the live stream before I forget. Let's see. Okay, it says I'm live. Okay, wonderful. Dear friends, thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. We've gathered here to listen to Dr. Stephen Phelps tell us about, I believe the topic is what is reality? Is that right?
Oh,
What is
wow.
real? Yeah.
What is real? Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to see what that's all about.
Yeah.
I can't either.
Wonderful. Considering you thought you had 2 more hours to prepare, right? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to kick things off with an opening prayer, if that's okay with everyone, and then
Yes.
we'll move into the introduction and whatever follows that.
Okay.
O my God, verily these servants are turning to thee, supplicating thy kingdom of mercy. Verily they are attracted by thy holiness and set aglow with the fire of thy love, seeking confirmation from thy wondrous kingdom and hoping for attainment in thy heavenly realm. Verily they long for the descent of thy bestowal, desiring illumination from the sun of reality. O Lord, make them radiant lamps, merciful signs, fruitful trees and shining stars. May they come forth in thy service and be connected with thee by the bonds and ties of thy love, longing for the lights of thy favor. O Lord, make them signs of guidance, standards of thine immortal kingdom, waves of the sea of thy mercy, mirrors of the light of thy majesty. Verily thou art the generous, verily thou art the merciful, verily thou art the precious, the beloved. So, Dr. Stephen Phelps received dual bachelor's degrees in physics and philosophy from Stanford University, and he has a doctorate in physics from Princeton University, specializing in cosmology. He served at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel, for 13 years in its research department, where he coordinated the indexing and collation of the Baha'i sacred writings and their translation from Persian and Arabic into English. During that period, he concurrently held a research position in the physics department at the Technion University in Haifa and published original research on the masses of nearby galaxies. He currently resides in the Portland area with his wife and 3 daughters. His recent contributions to Baha'i scholarship include 2 book chapters, one titled The Writings of Baha'u'llah, the other Science and Religion, that will both be printed in an exciting new volume called The World of the Baha'i Faith, which is slated to be published by Routledge at the end of this year. Arguably the most important of his recent contributions, a legacy that will surely benefit students of the Baha'i writings for generations to come, is a document called A Partial Inventory of the Works of the Central Figures of the Baha'i Faith. This is a wonderfully comprehensive resource he has put together that catalogs more than 24,000 writings and recorded utterances of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdul Baha, correlating both authorized and even provisional English translations of these texts with their respective original sources. This part won't come as any surprise to him, given how much I've pestered him about it in all this time. But I honestly don't know if a day has gone by since he first released that inventory almost 2 years ago that I haven't used it at least once. I'll be sharing links to both the World of the Baha'i Faith and the Partial Inventory to the Zoom chat in a little bit. And before I hand things over and let Dr. Phelps finally begin, I just want to ask everyone either to save their questions and comments for the end, where we can actually have the live Q&A, or if you like, during the talk, you're welcome to submit them here on Zoom by using the chat feature at the bottom. I will say we are also streaming this Fireside on YouTube Live. We have a few concurrent viewers as I'm monitoring this on my other monitor. So if you are signed into a YouTube account, you're welcome to leave questions and comments via YouTube. And if none of those suits you, if you'd rather text your questions for whatever reason, you can do so to our dear Ajit. His phone number is 281-788-0380. He's graciously agreed to receive texts and relay them to me so that I can pose them to our distinguished speaker when the time is right. So finally, with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Stephen Phelps.
Thanks. Thanks, Adib. I should also mention that much of your work is included in this inventory, as you are prolifically producing beautiful provisional translations of the writings. The graduates get added to the index.
It's kind of you to say thank you.
I'm going to try sharing. I don't want to share my whole screen. I just want to share, if it's possible, I just want to share the window so that I can have my notes open in another window. Let's see if there's a way to do that. When it goes to share screen, oh yes, I can do this. I think we can make this happen. All right, are you all seeing
There we go.
what is real?
Yes.
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 All right. So unfortunately, because I'm 2 hours short in time, you'll find out what happens in those last 2 hours when I normally have them, which would be adding and dressing up the PowerPoint slides, maybe with images to make them more interesting. So all you've got is a very bare bones PowerPoint to go along with my comments this evening. So I took the title "What is Real" just to see what would happen, I guess experimentally, what would happen in dealing with this incredibly vague and huge question. And what I'm going to, I think, what I'll eventually come to is an introduction to the Baha'i teachings. But to get there, I want to start by asking this question: what is real? And immediately when you hear the question, you might think, well, why is this an interesting question? Isn't the answer obvious? You know, why complicate things? What is real is what is accessible to our senses. You know, this table I'm sitting at is real. The house I'm sitting in is real. Why is it that we can't all just take the simple answer to this question of what is real and say, well, what is real is what is obvious to all of us, which is the realm of experience. And that's sort of where this whole conversation begins, because the next question we ask is, do we have reason to doubt that what we directly experience is real, or do we have a reason to believe that there's something more real even than what we experience? And what is it that might lead us to suspect that this would be the case? That what seems so obvious is really not obvious at all. And so this question of, the philosophical word for it is ontology, the study of what is real, has to pretty immediately move into a different philosophical subject, which is epistemology, which is how do we know what it is that we know? Because it's by taking, let's say, a brief tour of some epistemological ideas, asking how it is we know things in different ways, that we will end up, I think, justifying the provisional conclusions we come to about the nature of reality. So in motivating the search for a real beyond the world of appearances, we might start with direct experience itself. For all the obviousness and tangibility of it, there are a few, let's say, problems with direct experience that might lead us to conclude that this isn't the full story. First of all, there are all sorts of things that we seem to experience directly that aren't in fact real. For example, mirages seems very real until you walk across the desert and realize that it's not really there. So our senses can be fooled. They're not exactly reliable measures of what is ultimately real. Secondly, there are many things that we directly experience that seem to arise from an abstract layer of reality. And what I'm referring to are the effect of ideas very tangibly in our lives, both positively and negatively. The idea of love, of honor, of faithfulness, these things we experience in our lives tangibly. We'd like to believe that there's something out there. We would like to infer that the love we feel is a manifestation of something that goes beyond the individual act of love that we're experiencing. And this moves in both directions, by the way. The hatred we feel, the ideas that divide us so tangibly, the idea of our defining features being race or nationality or gender or a number of other things, are very real, that we experience them as very real things, and they have very tangible effects in the world, but these seem to be realities that themselves are in some way abstract. So this is just a very brief attempt to suggest that the evidence of the senses may suggest that there's something beyond the senses themselves, that there may be a layer of reality, a realm of reality beyond the senses. But the senses themselves being unreliable, it needs further investigation. So we go to a second possible avenue of information about the real. And that would be the combination of sensory experience with reason. What about science? What about this amazing ability that we have historically of fairly recent origin in just the last few centuries? We hit upon this almost magical method of investigating the world in a certain systematic way, inferring things from that investigation, testing those inferences and testing those models. And what comes from that is apparently we find that there is something stable behind the shifting realm of appearances. Scientists might call that the laws of nature. But isn't that an abstract reality that somehow exists behind any particular instance of something? Doesn't that, the existence of the laws of nature themselves, indicate that there is some kind of realm of abstraction which really is there behind particular experiences and observations we may make? Historically, of course, science has been so successful at explaining things that many ideas, abstract ideas that were for a long time considered real, have been discarded. Ghosts, supernatural events, miracles, and so forth. Through the onward march of science and its expanding understanding of the world, it's found that there's less and less need to posit the existence of all sorts of abstract or non-physical things to understand the world around us. And many are tempted on this basis to simplify, therefore, and discard any notion of a realm beyond the senses. We call this scientific materialism. But as I mentioned, just the fact that science is able to uncover patterns, and that these patterns are persistent across many different observations, i.e. that there is a mathematical regularity that defines relationships between things, is almost a what one might say among the strongest evidence we have for the existence of some sort of abstract realm behind that of the senses. Thirdly, we might look to something like personal inspiration for evidence of something beyond the realm of the senses. Spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, having dreams that are that meaningfully become real, having almost tangible experiences of spiritual realities, which are very convincing to those who have these kinds of experiences, and so cannot be discounted as evidence, but not everyone has these experiences, and these experiences typically cannot be shared with others. And some, on the basis of these sorts of experiences, some people end up going in strange directions that seem not to align with reality. So even the personal experiences that people have, as convincing as they may be to them of the existence of something real beyond the realm of the senses, as with the actions of reason, the fallibility of the scientific method, as with the fallibility of our senses, it would seem that this method of gaining knowledge is also fallible. Also, and this has become more and more of a topic these days, many religious or mystical experiences can be had through the shortcut of taking psychoactive substances. Are these kinds of experiences admissible as evidence for the existence of a realm of abstraction beyond the senses? Or is it just proof that brain chemistry and thus our perceptions can be temporarily altered? And finally, one might bring as evidence tradition, the authority of those who have gone before us. Human beings have a long history of accumulating knowledge and wisdom, which generation after generation has proven to be useful or true or correct. Most human cultures around the world, and the traditions that they represent, all hold to the existence of some reality beyond the physical. And so there seems to be a human social consensus of tradition that this physical world is not the thing that's most real. But as we know, human consensus is not reliable. People believe the Earth to be flat for most of human history. All sorts of false and pernicious ideas have led to so much human suffering and wars and destruction. And so why should we trust even the accumulated weight of the best human thought throughout history, knowing that's fallible as well? So, and then really as a subset of tradition and authority, we might mention divine inspiration, a combination of the third and fourth of these methods of knowing. Divine inspiration being the authority claimed by a prophet who claims through inspiration to have received information and or inspiration about a realm beyond. And for so many people, that alone is, and the religious communities that arise, the holy books that are written, these are for many people the foremost evidence for the existence of something real beyond the physical. But of course, religious traditions around the world are not all unanimous in their theologies, and there is a great deal of differences between these religious traditions. Differences that go more than skin deep. Differences that seem to go down to certain theological fundamentals. Looking for instance, at the vast theological gulf between the religions of the West and the East, as which can be summed up in the difference between the robust monotheism of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition on the one hand, and the non-theistic traditions of religions of the East. And so relying upon religious inspiration as proof may also may be unreliable as well. Perhaps it's better initially to distrust any kind of authority in these matters, those who claim to bring the truth about things invisible, whether these authorities are secular or religious. And it may be that at some later stage, we may decide that a certain authority is reliable, a secular or religious authority is reliable, but that would not be our starting point. That may be more of an ending point. And so from this, we may conclude that there are various scattered suggestive hints, none by themselves entirely reliable, that the world, that the true world, that there is a realm of the real that in some way transcends the obvious and tangible realm of the senses. But it's a confusing situation because there's no consensus on this. It's as though something about the human perspective itself is essentially limiting. It's as though we're trying to drink the ocean through a straw, or it's as though we're born blind in some way and unable to see certain wavelengths of light that are crucial for understanding the world around us. A model for reality that is perhaps one of the most influential ideas in history, both in the philosophical tradition, seen in a secular light, as well as in the religious tradition, certainly the religions of the West, has been, and most of us have probably encountered this at some point, is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And this dates back to 300 or 400 BC. It was uttered by Socrates and recorded by Plato. And this encapsulates this idea of the fundamental limitation of human perception, as well as the idea of there being some realm of reality which is more real than the realm of appearances. Very briefly, the allegory is that of prisoners chained to the floor of a cave in such a way that they're only able to look in one direction against the wall of the cave, upon which have been projected shadows, moving shadows of various puppet-like figures that are being paraded back and forth behind them, illuminated by torchlight, so that on the flickering wall of the cave, all of these prisoners see are a shifting landscape of shadows, appearing, reappearing, moving about, getting larger, getting smaller, and so forth. And that is, Plato says, the best approximation to the human condition as regards our knowledge of the real. It's such a rich analogy because it encapsulates so many ideas can be folded into this allegory of the cave. Among them is the idea that if all that one can see is the shadow, then of course one is limited in one's perception of reality, but one is not at the same time entirely disconnected from it, because one is still seeing shadows, and the shadows are not arbitrary. The shadows are the shadows of the real. And so it may be possible to learn something about the real through the proper analysis and understanding of the shadows, even if one has never been able to turn around and see what it is that that is casting these shadows. Although, as part of the allegory of the cave, every now and then one of the prisoners breaks free of his chains and turns around and sees this whole setup and realizes that there is a more real, there is a realm of reality which is more real than the shadow realm, which is the puppet-like figures and the firelight. But the richness of this cave analogy goes beyond that, because the prisoner, having broken free of the chains, then escapes the cave and moves about in the real world and sees the actual animals and people and figures that were represented in puppet-like form while he was chained in the cave. And of course, those animals and people and and other sorts of figures themselves, according to Plato's theory, are themselves instances of some even more abstract realm of forms. So Plato's allegory of the cave really includes 4 different levels of reality. There's the level of the shadow, which is where we are perennially trapped. There's the realm of the puppet figures that create those shadows, but the puppet figures are copies, imperfect copies of the actual figures, the animals and people and so forth that exist on the surface of the earth, which are themselves the instances of even more abstract archetypes or forms that exist only in the Platonic realm. So this model of reality then acknowledges that we're forever confined to this realm of experience. I mean, assuming we're not one of the lucky ones who gets to break their chains. We are forever trapped in the cage of bodies that sense things in a certain way. And we're forever trapped inside brains and minds whose plasticity and power is not infinite. Minds which are deeply embodied and as such limited. Minds which are able to think in certain ways owing to our embodiedness, but which find it either very difficult or very counterintuitive or maybe even impossible to think in other ways, which may in fact correspond more closely with reality itself. This allegory of the cave, which one could say is really a governing vision of reality that would be familiar to most religions. What remains for us to do then is to ascend as best as we can the ladder of the real. First of all, to understand the shadows as best we can and try to infer from the shadow realm as much as we can about that higher realm of the figures behind our heads. Strive if we can to be among those few who escape the cave. In other words, we are born into a condition which is at the lowest rung of a ladder of consciousness, which it is our mission, which we are thrust into the world in order to ascend that ladder as far as we can. And so this allegory of the cave then gives us a kind of, it suggests what we should do in pursuit of the real. It suggests an epistemological program in which the first way station in this epistemological program is the humble acknowledgement of our inability to directly perceive the real. And that's an important first step to make, because that enables us to look around us and see all of the other fellow prisoners in the cave, and to understand that if none of us are directly perceiving the real, and if all of us are looking at it from our own particular angle, then it gives us a basis for finding some kind of unity within the diversity of human experience. A basis which we wouldn't necessarily have if we really believed that we could directly see the real. So starting with this standpoint of deep epistemological humility is the first step, which is suggested to us by this allegory of the cave. And the second thing is the idea that we come to know the real, we get closer to the real within our position of confinement in the cage, by looking at the effect of the real, by looking at it indirectly, by looking at the shadows. And what we can do is test reality by forming models and hypotheses about it and testing those hypotheses. If you're the prisoner in the cave, the best you can do is come up with some theory. Well, I see this particular shadow appearing and reappearing, and maybe in slightly altered form, and maybe that means that it's really a three-dimensional figure and it looks like this. And having that theory, you then, when you see further instances of that shadow, that theory can be confirmed or disconfirmed by the evidence. In other words, what one is left with to evaluate reality is essentially a pragmatic lens. Since there's no direct perception of it, and since one cannot or should not simply take on authority what someone else says they think it is, or what they claim to absolutely for fact know what it is, what one is left with is a kind of pragmatic lens. You test it continually by seeing if it works. You take on a scientific method, and that scientific method extends not just to physical predictions about what the constituents of this world might be, but it also extends to moral realities. It extends to statements about what we ought to do, as well as statements about what is. And these statements about what we ought to do also need to be tested. Well, do they work if we put this into practice? Does it improve the human condition individually, collectively? And even the proposition that there is some realm behind the world of appearances, even the whole idea that the allegory of the cave is the right way to look at our relationship to reality, even that allegory of the cave should be part of our pragmatic test. In other words, is this a useful allegory? Does this advance human progress in some way? Does this bring us, and you can't say, well, does it bring us closer to the truth? Because none of us know what the truth is. But what we can say is, does it conduce to human progress? Does it conduce to the reduction of suffering? For all of for everything we want to test, we prisoners in this cave of the world, whether it be scientific realities, moral realities, religious realities, spiritual realities, we have a scientific method to test these realities, which is, does it work? And this brings us to some of the Baha'i teachings, I think, relative to this picture of reality. And the first one, and I have some quotations which we can look at, which we can walk through. And the first one actually is the idea of there being a pragmatic lens is, I believe a really revolutionary way of looking at religion. It's revolutionary because we're invited to test for ourselves, in a way, the truth of it. We're invited to see religion, and this is Baha'u'llah's imagery, as a kind of remedy for an illness. In one of his well-known works, Baha'u'llah compares himself to a divine physician who has his finger upon the pulse of humanity, who perceives the illness and prescribes in his infallible wisdom the cure. Baha'u'llah is not asking us simply to accept that authority claim without further proof. But embedded in that claim, I am the physician and here's the remedy, lies the means by which we can ascertain for ourselves whether Baha'u'llah is a divine physician or not, which is, if we put this into practice, does it improve the human condition? Is it in fact a remedy? A few other Baha'i teachings which I think sum up this position, our position with regard to reality, are, first of all, and this is basically now reiterating what I've stated, but now through the lens of the Baha'i teaching. So my argument this evening is that what I've just described, essentially a Platonic idea through the allegory of the cave, is what we also find in the Baha'i teaching. So first of all, the first idea is that this world of appearances is not real. And I'm selecting one out of probably dozens of passages from the Baha'i writings that say this. And most of these will be from Abdu'l-Baha. Know that the kingdom is the real world, and this nether plane is only its shadow stretching out. So extremely direct sort of reference could easily be mapped onto the cave allegory. This world of appearances is not real. Secondly, we can never experience the real directly. We infer something about it through its attributes, i.e. the shadows. Abdu'l-Baha puts this in theological terms. There's a theological formulation of this, which is that knowing God means the comprehension and knowledge of his attributes and not of his reality. And even this knowledge of his attributes extends only so far as human power and capacity permit, and remains wholly inadequate. All that man can hope to achieve is to comprehend the attributes of divinity, the light of which is manifest and resplendent in the world and within the souls of men. That's the theological formulation of this idea that we can't experience the world directly, but only through its attributes. The scientific formulation of this is precisely the scientific method itself. It is the model building, the inductive method that formulates hypotheses from a small number of data points that test that hypothesis by deducing what may follow from this model and testing that model. And ultimately, that scientific method never claims at any point to be anything more than a model. It never claims to be essentially looking at the attributes of something which we may infer is just one facet of some larger reality. Thirdly, this reality that we can't experience directly, but can only be experienced indirectly through its attribute, we are individually responsible for seeking it out. We cannot and must not simply take on faith or on what other people tell us through whatever position of authority they tell us. This is central to the Baha'i teachings. It enables the seeker after reality to break free of the restrictive dogmas of the past. Abdu'l-Baha again writes, among these teachings, and this is in the context of a list of many Baha'i teachings, was the independent investigation of reality, so that the world of humanity may be saved from the darkness of imitation and attain to the truth, may tear off and cast away this ragged and outworn garment of 1,000 years ago, and may put on the robe woven in the utmost purity and holiness in the loom of reality. So we're each individually responsible for seeking out the real, but along with that comes a complication. And the complication is that because we are all individually and socially conditioned, we will come to different conclusions about the nature of the real. The problem of diversity, in other words. And Baha'u'llah states this, Baha'u'llah himself states this in the following terms. He says, since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise as a consequence as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled and can in no wise be averted. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. It's a fantastic statement. He basically acknowledges the irreducible complexity of the human condition as comprising all sorts of irreconcilable views about reality. But he also gives what the solution is. And the solution is not the reduction to a single dogma, but kindness, mercy, forbearance, overlooking what we perceive to be the shortcomings of others. No doubt they perceive other shortcomings in us. And that the harmony is then established not by fiat and not by a universal acceptance of a single dogma understood in the same way, but rather through what I would argue the fact that through this diversity of human experience and different conclusions, there is nevertheless enough consistency in this shadow world to form a basis for consensus and for a collective action. And again, out of hundreds of quotations, Abdu'l-Baha says, the central purpose of the divine religions is the establishment of peace and unity among mankind. Their reality is one. There is, behind the diversity of appearances in the world and behind the diversity of individual interpretations, as each individual pursues their own attempt to grasp reality, behind all of that is enough consistency that there's a basis for us to come to a point of collective action. As messy as that might be, but the messiness, the messy consensus that I will argue, and this is a slide that probably should be its own presentation, because there's really too much in here. But that messy consensus, which by the way is consistent with our scientific understanding of the physical world, is first of all that the world is primarily characterized not by things, but by connections. The more modern physics went into the structure of the atom, the more it realized that it was empty space. The fundamental constituents of matter, as far as modern science has been able to tell, are extensionless points characterized by certain quantum numbers, which are related to other extensionless points through mathematical laws of relationship. You know, the base level of reality is not stuff, but connections. The Baha'i writings also state that it all boils down to connections and relationships. In one of his talks, Abdu'l-Baha defines religion in these terms. He says religion consists in the essential relationships that proceed from the realities of things. And elsewhere, he gives the identical definition for nature. He says nature is those essential relationships that proceed from the realities of things. So this is, I think, part of the consensus is that the base layer of reality is relationship, and that these relationships are pervasive. That more connectiveness means a higher degree of reality. This is shorthand for a long topic of the existence of what one might call hierarchy, a hierarchy of existence. The word hierarchy is really a fraught term because it can also be used to define oppressive social structures. But when I use the word hierarchy, as I believe Abdu'l-Baha uses it, he says it more in the sense that there's an ever-shifting and fluid ladder of relationships from the lowest level, which is atoms maybe glomming together to form rocks and planets and galaxies and so forth, to the highest level of the fine-tuned conglomeration of atoms and elements that exist in the human body that unlocks this amazing power of human consciousness. And in between the rocks and us are this infinite gradations of complexity, which gradually unlocks greater and greater degrees of consciousness. This is not a static situation. It's not a static chain of being that Abdu'l-Baha proposes, but rather a very evolutionary one. The world is evolving and everything is in constant change and flux. Another reason why there cannot ever be a single one ring to rule them all kind of dogma or set of propositions about reality. because the world itself is constantly in a state of evolution. And that evolution is trending towards self-knowledge. Both individually, it's our purpose to maximize our knowledge of the true knowledge of our own selves, which is identical to the knowledge of the divine in the end. But also cosmically, the cosmic movement of things. What I'm talking about is evolution, Darwinian evolution, which maps out over billions of years the emergence of life and its evolution from the simple to more complex. This messy consensus that I would propose would include an idea that the world is constantly in motion, but that motion is not entirely random, but that motion is trending towards something. And what it's trending towards ultimately is what one might call self-knowledge. Again, cast in theological terms, one would say God created the world so that he could be loved, which Baha'u'llah's Hidden Words states, and which many other religious traditions states. One can state that same idea in physical terms, as say John Wheeler did in the 70s when he proposed an idea which he called it from bit, which is that the universe creates itself through its own quantum mechanical recursive act of self-observation. I believe in scientific language that's really no different than what in theological language you would say God created the world so that he could become known. It's the completion of a circle. And because that's the direction of movement, that's where things are trending, that is why love is better than hate. That is why justice is better than injustice. That is why a consultative framework for moving human society forward collectively is better than arbitrary authority. That is why unity is better than disunity, because all of these things, love and justice, consultation, unity, which are among the core principles of the Baha'i faith, all of these things tend to trend towards the upbuilding of things, things coming together in ever more complex configurations, thus unlocking what we might call ever greater spiritual potentialities, what one might in secular terms say ever increasing degrees of consciousness. I believe it's ultimately the same thing. So that's as far as my prep went, minus the 2 hours that I was hoping for. But I hope this is enough anyway for us to have a nice conversation about it in the time remaining. So thanks for listening up to this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps, for coming and sharing this presentation. It seemed very well thought out, very fleshed out, not at all like, you thought you had another 2 hours to spend on it or anything like that. I guess at this point, like you were saying, we can open it up to Q&A. I wanted to start things off by saying that personally, I really loved how much resonance there was between the points in your talk on the nature of reality and what our writings have to say on this theme. And of course, one should expect that you would, do your research and then find ways to ground it into the writing. So that hardly comes as a surprise. And the quotes you selected are wonderful. They really are representative of what the stance of the faith, taken collectively, says on it. There were a couple of particular passages that also came to my mind as you were talking about this theme that only further, they really just strengthen and reinforce what you were saying. The first, actually, you quoted amply from Abu Baha, and there was one passage in particular that came to my mind from Baha'u'llah, that's translated in Gleanings, and it's probably one of my personal favorites in that collection, in which he says, "The world is but a show, vain and empty, a mere nothing, bearing the semblance of reality." And then he likens it to a mirage. He says, "The world is like a vapor in a desert, which the thirsty dreameth to be water, and striveth after it with all his might, until when he cometh unto it, he findeth it to be mere illusion." And then, of course, there's that story in it's in one of those tablets published in Summons of the Lord of Hosts. I think it's the Lohe Sultan or the Lohe Reis, where he's talking about Baha'u'llah's talking about his brother's wedding. There is this play called Shah Sultan Salim, and all of the marionettes and puppets come out of the box, and then just like that, they go right back in, and it makes him ponder the nature of reality. And there's a beautiful tablet that Abul Baha revealed for someone who was bereaved. I don't think this one has been translated, but he begins it by saying, آنچه بینی و یابی در این جهان فانی اوهام و مجاز خالی است نه حقیقت آسمانی, which very roughly would be something like that which you see and encounter in this ephemeral world is sheer illusion, an empty verisimilitude. Majaz is a tough one, like allegory, something that resembles reality but is not reality itself. And then he says, not the heavenly reality. So that tracks so much with what you were saying. And actually, as you were speaking, we got a YouTube comment, and you quoted at least once, maybe twice, from some answered questions. And this viewer kindly pointed out another one, another selection from that book, where Abul Baha says, it is clear that human realities differ one from another, that opinions and perceptions vary, and that this divergence of thoughts, opinions, understandings, and sentiments among individuals is an essential requirement. For differences of degree in creation are among the essential requirements of existence, which is resolved into countless forms. So I wanted to bring those up only to add to what you've said, and also just pose the question of how you might characterize the originality of, so to speak, of the idea that underlies all of these points on reality and the nature of it that you bring up in your talk. And I guess what I mean in asking that is that, would you say it bears at least some resemblance to Plato's allegory of the cave? Is it maybe affirmative of that allegory or similar models to some extent? Or would you classify it as something essentially unprecedented and novel? That's one question that comes to mind.
There's a phrase in Arabic, "Wala jadid tahta ash-shams." There's nothing new under the sun. I guess it's in English too. But I think every culture has their own version of this idea. And Baha'u'llah doesn't claim that this stuff is all new. You know, he says this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. In the opening to the hidden words, he says this is that which was sent down unto the prophets of old, clothed in the garment of brevity. So in one way, there's nothing new under the sun. In one way, this and I guess in a way, my whole presentation was designed to suggest that very fact, by reaching back to Plato's allegory of the cave and saying this is pretty much, it's hard to improve on that allegory, and the quotations I presented are sort of aligned to buttress that idea. But I think at the same time, while the Baha'i teachings are in large measure affirming and reiterating the timeless truths of the religions of the past, in particular the law of love. There's another passage, I think, on this topic where Baha'u'llah says that everything has changed in all the religions, all the laws and ordinances have changed. He says, except for the law of love, he says, which like a fountain is ever renewed and is constantly flowing. So there is that constant at the heart of it. But at the same time, and that's the beauty and the complexity of it at the same time, is that the world is not static. The world is evolving, and humanity is evolving, and with it, our religious conceptions can and must evolve. And I think one way in which the Baha'i writings, there are many ways in which the Baha'i writings represent an evolution in the concept and practice of religion in a, I suppose, more surface level and obvious way. But by surface level, I don't mean to say non-essential. There is the social teachings of the faith are explicitly updated to take place and be activated and lived in a world community comprised of all the diverse tribes and nations and races of the planet. every religion that came before in some way was directed to a particular tribe. It was addressing a particular people. And so the Baha'i teachings are, I think, are unique in that sense. The social teachings are unique in the sense that they are explicitly universal and transnational and transracial and everything in their content. But below that, even I think, is an even more radical set of ideas, I believe, in which Baha, and this is I guess I'll say this, but I can't really justify it without like a whole series of talks. But where Baha'u'llah appears on the surface to be affirming or repeating or delivering the same kind of theological landscape, say, that existed in Shiite Islam, which is also familiar to Judaism and Christianity. In other words, whereas Baha'u'llah's teachings may sort of, in the aggregate, by word count, may seem to be very much supporting traditional Islamic theology and beyond that, Judeo-Christian theology. Baha'u'llah's teachings also provide the seeds for the subversion of that ideology, which I would argue has to be done for the Baha'i faith to really fulfill its vision of being a faith for the entire world. Because there remain billions of people on the planet not under the shadow of this particular way of theologizing. And I'm referring to the religions of the East, sort of collectively in all their diversity, but which could be said to be more or less a thread that more or less runs through the Eastern religious tradition, is the thread of non-duality, and a thread of not atheism, certainly, but non-theism, at least in the sense of the theism as it's been constructed in the West. And particularly Baha'u'llah's earlier mystical writings gesture in that direction. And various of Baha'u'llah's statements and those of Abdu'l-Baha as well, I think, suggest that even these kinds of what we might take to be the rock bottom fundamentals that we all should agree on, oneness of God, even that is conditioned by culture. It's conditioned by time and place. Abdu'l-Baha himself, in Some Answered Questions, says the reality of God is sanctified beyond singleness, then how much more beyond plurality? And it's statements like that which I think can be highlighted as signaling a kind of theological posture which takes it outside of the orbit of certainly of Shiite Islam and outside of the orbit of Western theological thinking. And through this idea of the relativity of religious truth and the relative validity of radically different perspectives on the divine, it offers, I think, a kind of sandbox, a kind of theological sandbox within which all the traditions on the planet can come together. And by mentioning the Western theology and Eastern theology, I don't even mean to suggest that that's a complete set. I mean, one thing that hasn't yet, I think, really come into the conversation on the global stage yet, in the Baha'i faith or outside, is the incredible contribution of native traditions. I mean, I'm thinking of what little I have encountered and understand of the Native American tradition, with its profound understanding of the connectedness of all things, of us with our environment and so forth. There's a whole theological world there that has yet, I think, to enter into full dialogue with the more developed, at least written about, theologies of the major faith traditions of the world. So there's just a huge dialogue waiting to happen, and I believe that Baha'u'llah's teachings give us, through this epistemic humility, through this principle of the relativity of religious truth, make possible for the first time a kind of coming together, not around a single doctrine that everyone signs their name to, a new kind of creed like the Catholics have, Nicene Creed or something, but rather more of a metaphysics, a theology of relativism. Mujan Momin, a number of decades ago, a Baha'i scholar, wrote an article called "Relativism as the Basis for Baha'i Metaphysics." I think maybe even back in the 80s or late 80s, early 90s. I remember the first time I read it as like a high school student, I thought, no, this is all wrong. There's one true faith. There's one true way of looking at this, and that's just kind of a cop-out to say that relativism should be the basis. But as time has gone on, and as I've read more and I guess hopefully gotten wiser, I've come around more and more to that perspective, that and the perspective that it's possible for relativity, not relativism like all things go, so you have to include, I don't know, little green men and crystals and saying nice things to water and whatever weird ideas are out there. You don't have to say yes to all of that, but still at the heart is the idea of relativity, of religious truth, that there's a common essence that can be expressed in so many different apparently divergent and contradictory forms, which gives us the challenge of finding that spirit that actually unites it, behind the contradictory forms, understanding, grasping what that is, and then being able to share that spark.
That was an answer that was both thoughtful and thought-provoking. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Phelps. I've come across that paper that you mentioned from Dr. Momin before. Sadly, I haven't had much of a chance to read it. I think you're right. It was in the 80s or 90s, Relativism in the Baha'i Writings. And I think some years later, he may have expanded on it, or maybe not taken a different approach, maybe just built on it with another paper called The God of Baha'u'llah.
Yes. Yes.
That's another one. And I'll give this as kind of like both a shout out and a sneak peek or something. A very good friend of mine, some of whose work you may be familiar with, mostly in translation, Joshua Hall. He has an extensive paper coming out in the next issue of the Journal of Baha'i Studies in March, called Baha'u'llah and the God of Avicenna. And he addresses a lot of the ideas that Dr. Momin raises in that paper. So that's something for, I guess, everyone here, anyone interested in these subjects, to be on the lookout for. This whole discussion has generated a lot of great feedback. We have a comment in the Zoom chat. We have a raised hand, and we got another comment on YouTube. So I'll pose them to you, Dr. Phelps, in the order that we received them, in the spirit of trying to be fair, I suppose. So the first comes from our very own Ajit, who asked in the chat, how far can human understanding lead him? By which I assume he means just any given human being.
I guess the answer, consistent with this whole allegory of the cave, the answer would be only as far as its natural limits. Human understanding has intrinsic limitations. It's never going to reach, it's never going to get past the wall of the cave. To get past the wall of the cave requires something more than human understanding. It requires perhaps something more experiential. I think we're touching here on the difference between ilm and erfan, and I take human understanding here to mean ilm, in the sense of book learning, the stuff you can learn through a teacher, versus erfan, which is the stuff that you only learn by getting burned by the flame. There's a difference between learning about fire, what it is, the chemistry of fire and all of that. None of that is equal to sticking your finger in the flame and getting burned by it. And that's, I think, that's not an analogy from the Baha'i writings, actually, but it's a Sufi analogy, if not found elsewhere. And human understanding is it's the moths fluttering around the flame saying, yeah, we get it, we understand it, we're close to the flame, we're lovers of the light, but it's that one moth, that flies into the flame and its wings burn up in this flash of light. That's the one that actually understands the flame. But in understanding the flame, it's destroyed. So there's consequences to that. But maybe Baha'u'llah was referring to that in the seven valleys. You know, the last stage of the seven valleys is not like, you know, perfect understanding or something. It's annihilation. Fana, true poverty and absolute nothingness is how it's been translated, somewhat softened perhaps, but you know, it's self-annihilation. It's like whatever you thought was you is now gone. And the Sufis had another stage after that. The Baha'u'llah mentions in Gems of Divine Mysteries. It's not so much in the Seven Valleys as an explicit valley, but it's in Gems of Divine Mysteries as an explicit stage. After annihilation comes again immortality, baqa. After fana comes baqa. But that immortality that comes afterwards is not the immortality you think. It's not the immortality, oh, I get my whole self back and now I get to go up and sing with the angels on a cloud. It's baqa fillah. It's immortality in God. It's you die to the self and you live in God. What does that mean? I mean, perhaps it means the death of self and regaining life, but that life regained is the life of the mirror, which now perfectly reflects the light of the sun. You know, there's only one sun. That light is shining everywhere. You know, the personality of the mirror is no longer a factor because the dross has been entirely cleaned from its face, so that all that remains in the face of the mirror now is the light of the sun. And that's the same light that shines in every other mirror that's also been perfectly cleaned. So what you're left with is not perhaps a vision of immortality that we find comforting at first, because we're comforted by this childish idea of going to heaven and having a conversation with Saint Peter or whatever, and having a very individual experience. And I'm not saying Baha'u'llah doesn't actually describe it that way himself, but he also says he tells us things in ways that we can understand. I mean, that's a big part of his revelation, is we are told things according to our capacity. There's a tablet of Baha'u'llah's which probably for good reason hasn't yet been translated in an authoritative manner, where he says that the seeker who reaches certain stages in the spiritual search comes to certain understanding of things, which if told to those who are not ready to hear it, it will destroy their faith. And so it's incumbent upon the seeker to basically guard these treasures of knowledge that the seeker has, knowing that it would be destructive to the faith of those who are not ready to hear it. Now, I don't know, Baha'u'llah doesn't say, oh, and those realities are the following. One is left sort of to one's own devices to guess. But if I were to guess, it would be something in the direction that I've indicated.
That's fascinating. And again, as usual, there's so much support in the writings for what you've said. Actually, just within the last 3 minutes, I thought of two allusions to just the Arabic hidden words by themselves. This idea that God speaks to us according to our own language. He says that in one of the latter hidden words. And then this idea of baqa fillah, of course, he says, if thou lovest me, turn away from thyself. And if thou seekest my pleasure, regard not thine own, that thou mayest die in me and I may eternally live in thee.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful, beautiful alignment, Dr. Phelps. Thank you for that. I wanted also to share this comment that was left for us on YouTube a few minutes ago. This person says, it's actually the same person who kindly shared that passage from Some Answered Questions, so we're very grateful to him. He says, the pragmatic method of knowing requires that we test our models of reality to see if they conduce to human progress. It seems like our notion of human progress would depend on the very model of reality that we currently have and are trying to evaluate. Can we fairly evaluate our models of reality without using circular reasoning? And if so, how?
That's a great question. And that's why my last slide said the messy consensus. I put the word messy in there because of that question. Because it's not like there's some like magical way, even through perfect consultation, to sort of figure out what the truth of things are, to figure out what progress means in this particular instance, what the right law to enact in this particular instance, given these circumstances, is that would most conduce to the larger goal that we may all agree on, which is maximizing unity, maximizing human flourishing and so forth. But that doesn't mean that it's at all easy for us to know, okay, what's the next step? And that's where we have this beautiful process that's been given to us by our founders of consulting in a loving atmosphere, as free as possible from ego, with all the conditions that have been given. I think are the key to moving forward. They're not the key to unerringly pick the next correct step, but as long as the consultative process itself is not undermined, in the balance, one will end up moving in the right direction, even if one goes in the wrong direction for several steps. But that's always possible. And so there's no, and that also is one with this idea of epistemological humility that I stressed earlier on, that there's just no, given our embodiedness and given the intrinsic limitations that come with being encased in flesh, looking through one pair of eyes and not any other pair of eyes, there's just no way around the fact that there are going to be disagreements. There's no way around the fact that it's not going to be easy. And I love how Baha'u'llah directly addresses that in that tablet, which is fairly newly translated. It's in Call of the Divine Beloved, about this is a certain and settled fact and can be in no wise be altered. It's part of the tragedy and the sublimity of the human condition.
Thank you for that insight. It was a really great question and a wonderful answer, as expected. I want to move next to Elaine, who very patiently has been waiting with her hand raised. Thank you for being so patient.
Hello. Hello, Appa. As I was listening about the allegory of the cave, it brought to mind when I first started junior college, and it was a little exercise that we did where somebody comes in and shoots another person, and they have all of these people watching, and then they interview one person at a time to find out what exactly they saw. And the differences between, one to another person of that shooting. One came, they said that it came with a banana. Another one said that it was a real gun, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I came to find that in our minds, we create a world that is completely different from one to the other, that our own perception of the world, our perception of our society, our teachings, whatever, can differ so much from another person. And that has become even more evident. And when I moved over here with somebody that I knew but she was very young, and how my words or anything can be turned into how she perceives the world. And I'm going, this is very good reason why the Baha'i faith needs to have consultation, because we all have such different perspectives. And I have come to appreciate the Ruhi studies because of that, because all of us that are in the circle or studying are asked to give our opinions of what is there. And we can see the different interpretations of the words. And it's just amazing. Sometimes I'm going, how did that person come to that? Mm-hmm. Just really. But I think if I hadn't become a Baha'i, this would have been, well, maybe I wouldn't understand any of it. It's just because I'm still going through that. I'm going, how is it possible? This person really got this understanding from what I said or what I did or whatever.
Yeah. And then
And yeah, it's just amazing.
add to that, and that's the confusion that ensues from a room full of people who directly saw the thing themselves. And then imagine what happens when they then relate what happened to everyone else, in time, and then those people relate it to someone else, and then at some point it gets written down. So what version of the thing is going to get written down?
Right.
And that's the problem we face with most religious scriptures. I mean,
Exactly.
passed down through generations, and at some point written down. What remained of the original? Obviously, some spirit of the original remained. Otherwise, it wouldn't have such force in the world. It wouldn't, have a transmutative power, which every religious scripture has. But at the edges and the details, hard to imagine how one could think that they've all been preserved.
Call them synoptic and leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any other, anybody with a question waiting to be answered, but I'll just ask one last time. If anyone wants to raise their hand at the last minute. Otherwise, I think we can all express our appreciation and gratitude to Dr. Phelps for coming tonight and being so generous with his time and especially his knowledge. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Adi.
you.
Thanks, everyone else. Take care.
Adib, did you announce next month's speaker?
No, I should have transitioned that over to you since